on. I want to start out. So this chapter begins rather abruptly, I would say, in Lavin and Schultz. And by abruptly, I mean that it starts out with this big word called feminism, and it just throws it right at us, feminism. And all of a sudden, we're trying to ponder the meaning of feminism, and our brains are wondering if we should trust these feminists or not. And so I guess I wanted to back this up a tiny bit. If I had my choice, I would actually read or write the book. So the chapter on kinship and marriage and family, which we're going to read for next time, or the first part of it, came before this chapter on gender and sex and sexuality. And I'll tell you why I'm going to say that here. In part, it's because of how this happened in anthropology. Which is to say, when the early anthropologists, when anthropologists are going out in, say, the 1910s and 1920s, were very interested in how people were related to each other, how people kind of thought about reproduction and the reproduction of society and how they considered their kin to be. And we'll be talking about this, of course, soon. And so this was something that was of early interest to anthropology. And for the most part, I would say that a lot of these early anthropologists assumed what we now call heteronormativity. Ooh, that's another big word. So they assumed that the normal or natural way to do things was that there were two sexes, man and woman, and that those two sexes should be married in long-term monogamous relationships that have children in stable family households. And I mean, I think that this was basically the assumption that they were starting with. There were some early anthropologists, which Lavin and Schultz mentioned Margaret Mead, perhaps the most famous American anthropologist ever. And she wrote a book called Coming of Age in Samoa, as well as her teacher and Ruth Benedict, who I've given you a quote from about, the purpose of anthropology is to make the world safe for human difference. Both of them, in some ways in the 1930s already, were starting to think about sex, gender, and sexuality in slightly more open ways, partially based on the evidence of anthropology, partially because they may have themselves been in a same-sex relationship at certain points and so knew how difficult it was to navigate in the academy, in the world as it was. And so although the prevailing assumption in society, and perhaps in many of the early anthropological studies, was that there is this natural or biological way to do things, and other things were suspect, there were some voices of difference already showing up from early on in the anthropological record. What they found was that people did kinship in all kinds of different ways, things that they probably weren't expecting, and that they weren't, that it didn't create unstable societies to reckon kinship in different ways and to think about your relationships in different ways than had been assumed to be true. And so this is what we'll be talking about for Thursday's class. And then we'll split. This is a pretty long chapter coming up. Our next chapter is one of the longer ones. And then for a week from today, we'll be talking about forms of marriage and the family. And again, the finding was that, wow, people do this in all kinds of different ways. It's actually not, people don't all do this the same way. And so this is what they found from thinking about this. And if they then turn to these issues that we're going to talk about of gender and of sex and of sexuality, I would say that the finding is, and this is going to sound perhaps a little weird, but I'm going to put it this way. We have this assumption, I think, that things are getting weird now. Like in the last 10 years, boy, things have gotten really weird and people are thinking about gender differently. And my statement on this is that whatever seems strange to us today, and this includes even operations and all kinds of body modifications that people do, there are people either in past societies or in other cross-culturally societies who have been doing stranger things than even the things that we think of as, if we think of them as strange. I don't mean to, I guess by putting it that way, I just want to assure you that if you look over the cross-cultural and historical variation in the world, we're not even getting close in our society to anything near the practices that anthropologists have documented across different societies. But what feminism did is that as a social movement and as an academic exercise, it took this earlier data that people had on kinship and gender and sex and sexuality and said, wait a second, we can do something with this. This is interesting. It's not just something you file away as like, oh, they're pretty bizarre over there in that part of the world. It actually could say something about our own organization of ourselves, and if we and sort of the limits or what they call the plasticity of human society and the plasticity or the flexibility of human behavior in different places. So this is a crucial contribution to taking some of this old stuff that people had been kind of collecting and as just, you know, stuff that people do that we don't know how to think about. And other scholars, especially influenced by feminism, were able to think about this in new and different ways and to actually then say something about all kinds of different societies. So I guess one of my main messages is, don't be afraid of the feminists, don't be afraid of feminism. Very helpful to us here when we think about this moment in analyzing our lives. One of the crucial contributions, one of the things that the feminists helped us perhaps the most with is the distinction between sex and gender. And so, well, actually, anybody, what is the difference between sex and gender? As we're going to be using them.
So sex would be like the physical characteristics, and then gender would be like, it's like their roles or things like that within the society.
Absolutely, beautiful, wonderful. So sex refers to any sort of physical or biological difference. And so it can refer to physical characteristics, hormones, genetics, anything that's sort of out there in the, you might say any sort of biological stuff, we're going to call that sex. And then if we think about what we expect of people who we believe are of a certain sex, or what roles we expect them to play, or what kinds of identities we think are appropriate for people given this biological difference, that's when we're talking about the cultural stuff of gender. Now, this was a great sort of innovation, I think, in a lot of different ways. The problem is in our society, or one problem is in today's society, people decided that it would be much more, how to say, sex just seems like an impolite thing to say because maybe it makes us think of that other thing, you know, and so people like to talk about gender. It just becomes another way, or it becomes a euphemism for sex. My best example of this right now is perhaps you've seen these gender reveal parties, right? Where I don't want you to ever do these because people are shooting things out of cannons and burning down forests, and it's just bad. But what the whole point of the gender reveal party is they've gone to an ultrasound and they're going to reveal what they say is the gender of the baby. These should really be called sex reveal parties, because what they're revealing is whatever result they have on an ultrasound. But they probably wouldn't, you know, it just sounds kind of yucky if you're saying it's going to be a sex reveal party. Much more polite to say a gender reveal party. So we're going to try and keep this distinction, though, that is hopefully helpful between the gender, the cultural expectations, and the biological differences. Now, one of the first feminist anthropologists wrote a really interesting article, basically back in the 1970s, and the article was titled, "Is female to male the same as nature to culture?" And so I've written it here as a kind of logical expression. Is this, and what she was asking, and this was sort of based on the ethnographic evidence from around the world, and what she was saying is there in all societies a gender binary between men and women? And is that gender binary expressed as the women are on the side of the natural, so conceived as being, homemakers and home takers and takers care of children and linked to these natural functions, and the men are seen as linked to the cultural, the public, the political? And so is there a universal gender binary? And does that mean that because we do not see examples of what we might call matriarchal societies, we see plenty of examples of patriarchal societies, does that mean that male domination is also in some ways a universal? And for Sherry Ortner, they say, Lavin and Schultz says she comes to a fairly, what they call a pessimistic conclusion that this is kind of true. Later on, people began to question. It was a really productive and interesting idea, and I think it's worth just sort of ruminating on. There are a lot of societies, I think our own is an example, in which people tend to associate women with homes and nature and natural stuff, and men with the public and the cultural stuff. But later work would look at different places in the world and say, wait a second, this idea of the public divided from the private, that is sort of the premise of this, or that culture is divided from nature, is actually an artifact of our own society. It is not something that other societies necessarily have. And even in many societies, that are not necessarily of the non-Western variety, you'll see, for example, women doing a lot of the economics and the marketing part of things. And so this is not something that is true cross-culturally. Also, people began to question the idea that in all societies, people break gender along a binary lines. And so there's a very complex section in Lavenda and Schultz where they talk about the work of Marilyn Strathern in Papua New Guinea, actually, where she's talking about these different conceptions of individuals as individuals, and sort of, it gets really complicated. But what she's trying to say is, in some ways, it doesn't sort of automatically break people in our Western sense into male and female. The other thing that people began to think about is what we call intersectionality, which is basically, I think, can be summed up as whenever you think about gender and the relationships of men and women, you also have to think about social class. So, the difference between being a middle class or an upper class woman and being in the working class can be huge, and perhaps even seen as even more enormous than the difference between male and female. And so this is something that, as a social movement, some of the what are called the second wave feminists had to grapple with, because a lot of the second wave feminists were a kind of white middle class movement who wanted access to jobs and employment, whereas a lot of other women felt they were in the working classes, felt they were being forced to work it was one of you put it in dead-end jobs. And so, they had very different issues when it came to trying to create solidarity across or within the category of gender. And same thing with race. The difference between being, a Black working class woman and a white middle-class woman might be so enormous that it really it's hard to draw a kind of parallel there along the lines of gender. So this is not to say that these categories will always determine or override each other. It's just to say that whenever we look at something like gender, we always have to think about the other issues or other social divisions that might be involved when we're expressing it. So basically, Ortner's formulation, this idea that male dominance was universal and that it broke down along a universal gender binary, was proved to be helpful, but in the end, not explanatory of how things worked in the world. The other thing I want to bring up, which kind of appears in a small part of Lavin and Schultz, and I wish they'd paid a little bit more attention to it, is the idea of two-spirit people, which is an expression that actually comes to us from societies that are indigenous to the Americas. And basically, what this, and there's some debate about the terminology here, because there's different, in the different Native American groups, they have different words or different expressions. And so a number of them have adopted the idea of two-spirit people. Basically, they are people who might be biologically male, but take on the gender roles of a female person. And so in these societies, they would be assigned to a third gender or considered to be blessed with two spirits. In some of these societies, they had a role that was special or was different from either men or women. And it could be the other way too. And so people talk about third or fourth genders. And this was actually an aspect of many societies that were indigenous to the Americas. What was perhaps fascinating, and we'll talk about this a little bit, or we'll talk about this more later, is that there were often what we might consider homosexual acts between a two-spirit person and someone that would be biologically the same sex, but they would not see themselves as having a homosexual identity, in part because if your gender identity is of a third gender or a two-spirit person, it's not even sort of in that binary that we have been describing. Now, in the anthropological literature, it's sometimes difficult. Again, I say this because remember when a lot of this has to do with recapturing accounts that were made maybe 100 years ago. And so they used a term called berdache, which is actually a derogatory term. It's something that the French introduced when they were exploring in the Americas, and it was the derogatory term for a male French prostitute. This was also something that the Spanish and other colonial authorities really wanted to stamp out and eliminate. And so there was a lot of discrimination against people, and it's only in recent years that indigenous societies in the Americas have tried to recapture some of the positive aspects of these identities, because they really were under colonialism and under the colonial rule, they tried to sort of stamp out these practices. This has been an interesting, again, I would like Lavin and Schultz to give a little more attention to this. There's an NPR special that was called Two Spirits, where they look at different societies that have some sort of role for a third or a fourth gender. And in their view, these come on every continent and are actually in hundreds of societies. So lots of them are in the Americas, but in other places as well, we see different kinds of gender ideas that are outside of the typical binary. So when it comes to gender, I think that we can be fairly confident that even in the places that are binary, even in those places that only consider people to come in two varieties, male and female, that there's a whole big difference in the social roles and expectations in different societies. In some societies, weaving is a task that only men do. In other societies, weaving is a task that only women do. So there's, there's some sort of association with maybe different kinds of clothing or different kinds of dress. Even in our own society, we now tend to have blue for boys and pink for girls. But 100 years ago, pink was the color for boys because red was seen as a masculine color, a sort of fiery color, and blue was the color for girls because that was seen as more of a subdued color. So even over time, these associations and these expectations can vary quite a bit, even if there's a sort of expectation that people come as a binary. And we can also see that cross-culturally, there are a lot of different places where they have ideas of third or fourth genders, or they would consider gender to be something that is played out along a kind of a spectrum, or in the work of Marilyn Strathern, as sort of having these individuated or individual parts. So there might be even strange ideas about gender itself. The other thing is that we have learned that gender is not something that people sort of automatically take on and just enact without any issues. So a lot of people have turned to the idea that gender is something that we perform, or that we make a performance of. Actually, Brooke, you talked about this. You had a great sentence from there, but what do you get out of this performativity section? Yeah, so there's this idea, I think, that a lot of people don't feel like there's anything to it. They just go right along. But many of you know that we get rewarded for good gender performances and we get penalized for bad gender performances. And so there's a lot of different examples of people who they not feel, completely. It's not that these things come. They start to feel natural as performances, but the idea is that when we do gender in the way that society is expecting us to, we get rewarded. There's a great example of this. I used to assign an article about the difference that would happen with male surgeons in the medical profession and female surgeons. And what they were saying is that with male surgeons, they would, it's kind of like the show ER, one of those shows, they would have what is called a doctor fit, where there'd be an emergency and they'd be like, give me a scalpel, give me this. And if they did that, that was seen as like, oh, good doctor. So they, people would rush over and help this person. And if it was a female surgeon who said exactly the same thing and did the same exact, doctor fit, people would slow things down, be like, what is she doing? Who does she think she is? So the same performance can be rewarded in some contexts and not rewarded or penalized in others. And so people learn how to do things that will make them valuable in today's world. So again, in the case of gender and social roles, we can see a whole variety of things that happen both over time and across different societies. We'll turn here to the idea of sexuality. And I want to start with just an observation from Lavin and Schultz, because I think a lot of us growing up in today's world, we think that the idea of either being heterosexual or homosexual is like an identity that has always existed in human history. And as Lavin and Schultz point out here, the idea that people took this on as an identity, I am heterosexual or I am homosexual, is actually a relatively recent idea. This is not something, especially in terms of, it's something that seems to have emerged a lot in the United States after World War II, so pretty recent. Now, what we mean by that, though, is that all over the place, in every society, we're going to see people who do different things that we would classify their actions as heterosexual or homosexual, and we could use the idea of biological sex to say, well, that's, you know, that's homosexuality, but that doesn't mean that people will identify as that. That identity may not exist in different societies, or I mean, in another society. And as several of you noted when you looked at the material from Nicaragua, the idea of who will identify as homosexual and who will identify as heterosexual is still something that varies in today's world, and even in contemporary societies in the Americas. So in this work in Nicaragua, there are men who may have sex with other men, but consider themselves to be completely heterosexual, as long as they're being what they would consider to be the active, or, you know, it's probably too late in the day for this, the active or the penetrating partner. And then that would be, oh, I'm, you know, completely heterosexual, even though in our world, we would classify that as a homosexual act. In terms of their identity, they would not see that as heterosexual. They would only see homosexual identity as being the passive partner or the recipient of this, and then that would be equated to homosexual. And one of you asked if this is true in other places, and this is something that shows up in a number of different societies, I think especially in places like Brazil and in parts of Latin America, where there is this idea. It's not, there's not, I don't know if there's a, I don't want to say that this is a better idea or a less misogynistic idea. It can still come with a pretty heavy dose of homophobia, but it is simply to say that there are different ideas out there, and what we consider to be, you know, an identity may in other places be quite differently conceived. The other thing that is kind of interesting, especially in terms of, because a lot of people think that it is only in today's world that we've seen in the West or in the United States that we see same-sex marriages or same-sex unions over time. This has actually been something that we see in many different societies. So actually, Francis, you saw this somewhere. What did you find out?
It was Mombasa, they were allowed to have partners as long as like they were married or their partner was deceased, they could have same-sex partners. And a lot of women would like choose other women to have partners outside of their marriage, not even just because like they were lesbian women yet, it was just because they felt that women provided more for other women than their husbands did.
Yeah, so different, right? And not different, not what we would expect, right? Now you'd seem to think, well, you know.
When you're married, it's one partner, you're done. So.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that it's interesting because, you know, I'm thinking back to my example of the anthropologist Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict. I mean, Margaret Mead was married at least 2 times in heterosexual marriages, and yet had, I think there was, in some ways, there was also in our own society something of, at points in time, a tolerance for that. But I guess I would just say that, you know, this has been a feature of other societies. They have not broken down. It has not been the end of civilization to have these things happen. And we see these ethnographically. Sometimes you have to look carefully because, you know, people aren't going to necessarily volunteer information. There still might be like I said, a good dose of homophobia or a good dose of misogyny, but this actually can happen, and there are standards for these kinds of relationships in other societies. So up to here, I think probably we're probably all good with the idea that things, we might not want to approve of everything, but we can at least recognize that there are different ideas cross-culturally and historically for how people do and should conduct themselves with regard to gender and identity. I then gave you an article which I really like, but it's, I will say, straight up that it is, it's a little bit on the edge of things, in the sense that, you know, I think that some people are at this point and some people are not. And I'm not sure, I'm not trying to say that you have to be at this point. It's basically trying to take the idea of the gender binary and some of the things that people have done to get to question the gender binary, and then take it into the world of biology, and especially biology, archaeology, and the bones of things. There they are, the skeletons. What are skeletons say about the sex binary? And here we have a picture of an athlete. Well, what did you get out of this article, John?
It's just like early anthropological research. It used to be that like, all right, like this is a male pelvis, this is a female pelvis, and then like looking over time, more researchers were like, nah, like it's it began to look the same, like with a male pelvis and female pelvis eventually became that.
Well, I guess, yeah, well, run with that a little bit, Emma. Is that how you?
So it was like they came up with this thing called Indeterminate Sex, which is like the skeletal remains that they weren't sure were female or male, like they could go either way. Because some were being incorrectly identified as male just because they had like smaller pelvis.
Okay, yeah, and I think there was somebody who took actually the forensics class, and in the comments said that was misidentifying pelvises. The thing about male and female pelvises as skeletals, as skeletal remains, there's not anything completely clear cut about identifying them. And so you have to sort of practice, and you have a range of averages. That's the way we do these bone things. You have a range of averages, and it is true that there's wider regions and narrower regions. But what they found is that some of them are not as clear cut as you might think. And so they introduced this sort of category of indeterminate, because for one thing, they were classifying a bunch of pelvises and skeletons as male, just kind of as a default category, when they actually, you know, I mean, the techniques have gotten better, but it's also the fact that we've realized that, you know, there are some, that the things are not as, how to say, things aren't as obvious as we once assumed they were in terms of identifying remains. And so this has led some people to wonder, and like I said, I'm not sure that we're going to be all here yet on this page, if it's our insistence on a gender binary, right? Our insistence that there are two separate genders, which makes us then see a sex binary. Again, like I said, this is a little bit out there for you, but Dylan, what did you learn about intersex?
I read a quote and it said like 1.7 million babies. I don't know if it was per year, but it said that they had intersex characteristics, meaning like hormonal and physical characteristics that describe how they have sex traits.
Yeah, things are complicated. I'm not sure, you know, I think if I'm not mistaken, it's something like, maybe if we count on the high end, 1.7%. But I guess I would say that the idea that people are just, you know, that when that gender reveal cannon goes off, that that's what you're going to get, is in some ways shaped by our very notion of how people are supposed to be. And so in the old days, you know, basically if someone came out in what we might call there was a certain amount of ambiguity about, well, okay, basically the doctors would kind of make a call, and they, you know, I mean, there are various, being of an intersex condition is not all the same thing. So some people, there's different characteristics of that And, I mean, I think that the doctors were probably trying to make a good call, but they basically surgically fixed them. And so there's been in recent years actually an intersex movement that says, hey, let's not just fix people surgically from the get-go. Let's let people live their lives a little bit and sort of figure this thing out. Like I said, I think that for the most part, I think that, there's a decent amount of biological binariness that goes on. But the things are not quite as, like I said, things are not quite as clear cut as we would assume. I looked up in the World Health Organization, their page on gender and genetics, because we often assume that, oh, well, maybe that's a hormonal imbalance. And if we just get to the genetics, then that'll tell us everything that we need to know. And what they were saying is that, that I forget my XX and XXYs and which is which, but that there are people that are born, with different types of chromosomal arrangements. So the XXY variety, about 0.2%, of the XYY variety, about 0.1%, of the XXX 0.1, X0 is kind of an interesting, very little known. And then they talk about, there's also males that are born 46XX due to the translocation of a tiny section. Basically, what I'm trying to say is if you add these things up and then you add up different hormonal things, there's a lot of there's a lot of interesting stuff that goes on biologically as well. So, like I said, I'm not trying to say that we're going to automatically assume that, some people have talked about, should we classify people biologically into 5 different sexes? Should we consider biological sex to itself be a spectrum? I think that it's interesting to think about these raise complicated issues, which are not going to be resolved, but there are things that people are starting to think about. Like I said, I think that what we can most take away is that across different societies, people have done all kinds of different things with gender and sexuality, and they've been okay. They've been okay. And so, I think that some of the things that we're starting to think about in terms of how people want to identify and express themselves and maybe be differently gendered or transgendered or non-binary gendered, we're going to be all right. It's not the downfall of civilization. People have done these things over time. And if we look across different societies, if we look across history, there's pretty much good anthropological support, good evidence that we can still run a society. And we may actually do okay if we let people be a little bit and be tolerant. And like I said, the biology is not quite as clear cut as people wanted it to be sometimes, or some people wanted it to be, and that's okay too. Nature, biology, all that stuff is a messy thing, as we saw in terms of race and different physical variation. People are all different, and we'll be okay.